previous segment, we discussed how humans domesticated fire and thereby began to become more and more powerful. At that stage, however, there are still many species of humans on planet Earth, and though fire made them more powerful and more important than before, they still remained relatively insignificant animals with little impact upon the ecosystem. The real revolution in the status of humans came only after the appearance of our own species, Homo sapiens. Our species evolved in East Africa sometime between 300,000 years ago and 200,000 years ago. The exact date is not known for sure, and scholars have endless argument about it in books and articles and conferences, so they don't really agree whether the first animal that can be called Homo sapiens, whether it appeared around 300,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago. But almost all scholars agree that by 150,000 years ago, East Africa was populated by Homo sapiens that looked basically exactly like you and me. Scholars also agree that around 70,000 years ago, some of these sapiens left East Africa and reached the Middle East. And from the Middle East, they quickly spread all over the Eurasian landmass. The Eurasian landmass includes Europe and Asia together. When Homo sapiens arrived in the Middle East, most of Eurasia was already populated by other humans, by the Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Homo soloensis and so forth. What happened to them? This is one of history's biggest and most important questions. What happened to all the other human species? Well, there are two conflicting theories. One theory is called the interbreeding theory. It tells about interbreeding between sapiens and the other species. It argues that as sapiens spread around the world, they bred with other human species, and that people today are the result of this interbreeding. For example, when sapiens reached the Middle East and Europe, they encountered there a local population of Neanderthals. Neanderthals, which we discussed earlier, they were humans that were more muscular and better adapted to the cold climates of Europe and the Middle East than sapiens. Neanderthals also had bigger brains than the brains of sapiens. They used tools, they used fire, and they were quite good at hunting all kinds of animals. How did Neanderthals look like? Well, you've probably all seen a caricature of Neanderthals, because caricaturists like Neanderthals very much. They usually depict them as brute and stupid cavemen. But according to the best evidence we have today, Neanderthals may actually have looked like this image that you can now see. This is a speculative reconstruction, but it is based on the remains of a real Neanderthal child whose remains archaeologists have discovered. There is also genetic evidence that at least some of the Neanderthals had fair skin and fair hair. So this is actually a better image of how Neanderthals look like than the usual caricature. According to the interbreeding theory, when Homo sapiens spread into Neanderthal lands in the Middle East and Europe, what happened was that the sapiens and Neanderthals bred, and the two populations basically merged to form a single population. If this is indeed the case, this means that Europeans and Middle Eastern people are not pure sapiens, but they are in fact a mixture of sapiens and Neanderthals. Similarly, according to the interbreeding theory, when sapiens reached China about 60,000 years ago, they met and bred there with the local population of Homo erectus and Homo denisova, and merged with them, so that Chinese and people in East Asia in general are also not pure sapiens, but a mixture of sapiens and erectus. The only people who are really pure sapiens may be Africans. So this is one theory, the interbreeding theory. The opposite view is called the replacement theory. And the replacement theory tells a very different story. It tells a story of incompatibility, of revulsion, and perhaps even of genocide. According to the replacement theory, there was no sex between sapiens and other human species like the Neanderthals or the Erectus. Sapiens and Neanderthals had different anatomies. They most likely had different mating habits. They may even had different body odors. And in any case, they had very little sexual interest in having sex with somebody from the other population, from the other species. Even if some Neanderthal Romeo met and fell in love with a sapiens Juliet, and they even had children together, then these children were infertile, according to the replacement theory. Just as donkeys and horses may mate, but they can produce only infertile mules, so a Neanderthal Romeo and a sapiens Juliet could produce only infertile crossbreeds. The two populations, according to the replacement theory, the two populations of sapiens and Neanderthals therefore remained completely distinct, the one from the other, and when the Neanderthals died out, their genes died with them. They were an evolutionary dead end. According to this view, sapiens replaced the other human populations in the world without merging with them. And if this is the case, this means that all living humans today, not just Africans, are pure sapiens. All living humans today share exactly the same ancestors, exactly the same great-great-great-grandmothers and grandfathers who lived only in East Africa about 70,000 years ago. So these are the two main theories. And the debate between these two theories is not only an academic debate, it also has very important political implications. From an evolutionary perspective, 70,000 years is a relatively short time. It is not enough time for important genetic changes to accumulate and to occur. So if the replacement theory is correct, and all humans today are the descendants of the same African ancestors from about 70,000 years ago, it means that all living humans today have roughly the same DNA, the same genetic baggage, and the same qualities that result from this genetic baggage. Racial distinctions between Africans and Europeans and Chinese and Aboriginal Australians, and therefore the differences between them are negligible if the replacement theory is correct. But if the interbreeding theory is correct, there might well be genetic differences between Africans, Europeans, Asians, and Aboriginal Australians that go back hundreds of thousands of years. For example, Chinese might have unique Erectus genes that Europeans and Africans don't have. Europeans might have unique Neanderthal genes that evolved for hundreds of thousands of years and that Chinese and Africans don't have. If this is true, it means that there might be significant differences between different populations of humans today, differences not only in physical qualities, but also in mental and psychological qualities, and this is obviously political dynamite. It's a very, very problematic notion that there might be these deep genetic differences between different populations of humans today. In recent decades, the replacement theory was the common wisdom in the field. First of all, because it had firmer archaeological backing, but also because it was more politically correct. The idea that there are deep genetic differences between different human populations is so frightening that people and scientists didn't want to go there, so they preferred the replacement theory. But this ended in about 3 years ago, in 2010, when the results of a 4-year effort to map the Neanderthal genome were published. Over the last decade or so, geneticists were able to collect enough intact Neanderthal DNA from all kinds of fossilized bones in order to map the entire Neanderthal genome. They took DNA from Neanderthal bones from this cave and from that cave and mapped the DNA. And today we have an entire map of the Neanderthal genome. And then what scientists did was to take this Neanderthal genome and compare it with the genome, the DNA of people living nowadays. And the results stunned the academic community. It turned out that about 4% of the unique human genes of modern people in the Middle East and Europe are actually Neanderthal genes. Now, 4% is not a huge amount, but it's not zero either. If this was not enough, then after a few months, a second shockwave came over the academic community when DNA extracted from the fossilized finger bone from the Denisova cave showed that up to 6% of the unique human genes of modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians are actually Denisovan genes. If these results are valid, and it's very important to keep in mind these are very new results, and all the time there is more evidence and more research being done, so we should be careful about jumping to conclusions. But still, if these results are valid, it means that there were at least some sexual encounters between sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans that resulted in the birth of fertile offspring, as that there are people today whose great-great-grandmothers and grandfathers were Neanderthals and Denisovans, and maybe other human species also. So the interbreeding theory has at least some truth in it. That doesn't mean, however, that the replacement theory is completely wrong. Since Neanderthals and Denisovans, even according to these new findings, they contributed only a very small percentage of our modern DNA, only 4% to 6%, it is impossible to speak about a real merger between sapiens and other species. If there was actual merger between the populations, like Europeans were a merger of Neanderthals and sapiens, we should have seen 40%, 50% Neanderthal genes and not 4%. So it seems that although the differences between sapiens and Neanderthals were not large enough to completely prevent fertile intercourse, they were still sufficient to make such fertile sexual contacts pretty rare. The populations, the ancient populations of sapiens and Neanderthals, they may have intermingled to a certain extent, but they did not merge. They remained distinct populations, distinct groups. Now, if this is the case, how should we actually understand the biological relations between sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans? Were they distinct species, or were they just different populations of the same species, different races of the same species? Now, given the new evidence, it is quite clear that sapiens and Neanderthals were not completely different species like horses and donkeys, because obviously we saw that they could have had fertile sexual intercourse. On the other hand, it would also be a mistake to view them as simply different populations of the same species, like bulldogs and spaniels. The truth is that biological reality is not black and white. It's complex. There are important gray areas in the way that we catalog and classify animals. The thing is, what you need to understand is that every two species that evolved from a common ancestor, such as horses and donkeys, were at one time just two populations of the same species, like bulldogs and spaniels. That with time, the two populations became more and more different from each other, more and more genetic mutations in the one remained just in this population and were not shared with the other population. So they became more and more different until they became completely distinct and went their separate evolutionary ways and became different species. But during this process of two populations becoming more and more and more and more different until they are different species, there must have been a point in time when the two populations were already quite different from one another, but were still capable on rare occasions of having sex and producing fertile offspring. Then another gene or two mutated, changed, and this cut the last connection between the populations, and they became completely distinct. It seems that about 50,000 years ago, sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans were exactly at that borderline point. As we shall see in the next lesson, 50,000 years ago, sapiens were already very different from Neanderthals and from Denisovans, not only in their genetic code and physical traits, but more importantly, they were already different, very different, in their cognitive abilities and in their social abilities. Yet, it was still just possible on rare occasions for a sapiens and a Neanderthal to have children together. So the two populations did not merge, but a few Neanderthal genes and a few Denisovan genes did make it onto the sapiens DNA. This is actually a pretty unsettling thought, and some people may say a pretty thrilling thought, that at least at one point in the past, sapiens, just like you and me, could have sex with an animal from a completely different, or from a different species, or from an almost different species, and not only have sex with an animal from a different species, but actually produce and raise children together with an animal from a different species. And it's interesting to think about it because, as we'll see in the last lesson of this course, when we reach the 21st century, we may be returning to that point in time when there are different species in humans in the world, and so the relations between them should be of great interest to us. As we'll see in the last lesson of this course, we might have more than one human species in the world in the next few decades. But going back tens of thousands of years ago, we still have one important question to answer. If the Neanderthals did not simply merge with sapiens, what exactly happened to them? Why did they vanish? One possibility is that Neanderthals became extinct because Homo sapiens outcompeted them. Now, what does it mean, Homo sapiens outcompeted them? Well, imagine that, say, 40,000 years ago, sapiens from the Middle East arrive to a Balkan valley, a valley in Greece or Bulgaria of today, where Neanderthals have been living for countless generations in the past. These newcomers, these sapiens from Africa, they of course have to eat. So they start hunting the local deer, and they start picking the local mushrooms and the nuts and the fruits and so forth, and they eat them. But this is exactly the food that Neanderthals too rely upon in order to survive. So the two species start to compete for the same food resources, for the same deer, for the same turtles, for the same frogs, for the same berries and fruits and nuts and so forth. And if sapiens, as we shall see in the next lesson, were already more sophisticated than Neanderthals in their techniques of hunting and gathering, this means that with time, sapiens had more of the food and ate more and bred, and their population grew. Whereas Neanderthals were left with less and less food, their population dwindled, and eventually they disappeared. except for perhaps for one or two individuals from the Neanderthal band which somehow managed to join the sapiens band, and this is how their genes came to us. So this is one possibility of how the Neanderthals disappeared. Another possibility is that the competition between sapiens and Neanderthal for the same food resources, it was not peaceful and quiet, but it flared up into violence and war and genocide. And this is quite a likely scenario because tolerance is not a sapiens trademark, is not a human trademark. When you think about our species, Homo sapiens, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Intelligent, yes. Sophisticated, yes. Ingenious, yes. But tolerant, no. Not us Homo sapiens. We are not a very tolerant species. In modern times, even a small difference of skin color, or dialect, or religion had been enough to prompt one group of sapiens to go about exterminating another group of sapiens. Would ancient sapiens have been more tolerant towards neighbors from a completely different human species? It's unlikely. It may well be, therefore, that when sapiens encountered Neanderthals about 40,000–50,000 years ago, the result was the first and the most significant ethnic cleansing campaign in history. Now, we don't know for sure which of these possibilities is correct, and in all likelihood, it didn't happen the same way in all the areas. In some areas, sapiens may have outcompeted the Neanderthals without using any violence. In other areas, they may have used some violence, a little violence, and in still other areas, they may have used a lot of violence and they actually drove away or exterminated the Neanderthal by force. Whichever way it happened, the Neanderthals disappeared. And their disappearance posed one of history's great what-if questions. What would have happened if things had turned out otherwise? Imagine how things might have looked like if the Neanderthals have survived alongside Homo sapiens. What kind of world, what kind of cultures, societies, and political structures would have emerged in a world where several different human species coexisted side by side? What if, in addition to the differences between Africans and Europeans, between Christians and Muslims, between rich and poor, between men and women, we also had to deal with the difference between sapiens and Neanderthals in our world today? How, for example, would religions have unfolded? Take Christianity. Would Christianity have taught that Jesus died for the sins of all humans, including the Neanderthals, or only for the sins of sapiens? What about heaven and hell? Would heaven and hell have been open to Neanderthals or only to sapiens? If you say were a good Neanderthal, you went to heaven along with the sapiens, and if you were an evil Neanderthal, a naughty Neanderthal, you went to hell alongside the wicked sapiens? Or the monotheist religions such as Christianity would have told us that no, Neanderthals don't have souls, and when they die, they just disappear. Nothing happened to them. What about modern politics? How do politics have developed? Could Neanderthals, for example, get the vote to parliament? Could they form parties? Would the American Declaration of Independence say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all members of the genus Homo are created equal? Or would it have reserved human rights only for sapiens and not for other human species? Would Karl Marx have urged workers of all species to unite, or only workers of the Homo sapiens species? There is a lot to think about here. This is why the disappearance of the Neanderthals was one of the most important events in history. It changed everything It changed the way that sapiens understand themselves, their place in the world, and their relations to all the other animals. It changed religion, society, and politics. Over the years, what happened is that Homo sapiens has grown so accustomed to being the only human species around that it's hard for us today even to conceive of any other possibility. The lack of brothers and sisters makes it very easy for us to imagine that we are the epitome of creation and that there is a gap separating us from all the rest of the animal kingdom. When Charles Darwin in the 19th century indicated that Homo sapiens was actually just another kind of animal, people were outraged. Even today, many people, even most people around the world, refuse to believe it, that sapiens is just one more kind of animals that evolved maybe in a slightly different way, but still it's not so different from the other animals. Had the Neanderthals survived alongside us, would we still imagine ourselves to be a very unique creature separated from the rest of the animal kingdom? Perhaps this is exactly why our ancestors wiped out the Neanderthals and the other human species. They were too familiar to us to simply ignore them, but they were too different from us to tolerate their existence. So the solution was to exterminate them. We don't know it for sure. It's just a speculation. What we do know for sure is that whether sapiens are to blame or not, no sooner had sapiens arrived at a particular location on planet Earth than the native population of other human species went extinct. The last remains of Homo soloensis in the island of Java are dated to about 50,000 years ago, just when Homo sapiens arrived at Java. Homo denisova disappeared shortly thereafter, about 40,000 years ago. The Neanderthals disappeared about 30,000 years ago. And the last dwarves vanished from Flores Island about 12,000 years ago. They left behind these various human species. They left behind some bones, some stone tools, a few genes in our DNA, and a lot of unanswered questions. And they also left behind us, Homo sapiens, the last surviving human species. What was the sapiens' secret of success, the secret of success of our particular species? How did we manage to spread and settle so rapidly over the entire planet in all kinds of ecologically different habitats? How did we, Homo sapiens, push all other human species to extinction? How come even the strong Neanderthals who had big brains and were better adapted to the cold climate of Europe and the Middle East, how did even then failed to survive our onslaught? This will be the subject of the next lesson.